I'd like to welcome you to our long-anticipated panel on thriving families and middle-class prosperity. Our first panelist is Nadine Mayenza. She's a noted speaker, writer, and policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for working families and a champion for international religious freedom. She is the president of Patriot Voices. And in May of 2020, she was reappointed by the White House to a second 2-year term on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and was elected in June as their chair. Next, we have Chris Buskirk. He is the editor and publisher of American Greatness and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Helen Andrews will be moderating the panel. Helen is the print editor of the American Conservative magazine and the author of a new-ish book called Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Next, we have Ramesh Ponnuru. He is the editor of National Review Online, where he has covered national politics and policy for more than 25 years. He has a column with Bloomberg Opinion and is a contributing editor to National Affairs. He's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the National Review Institute. And last but not least, we have Samuel Hammond, Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center. He has been published in the Atlantic, National Review, and the American Conservative. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, the subject of today's panel is thriving families and the American middle class, and something relevant to that issue crossed my Twitter feed not too long ago. Earlier this month, Blake Masters announced his candidacy for the U.S. Senate seat in Arizona, where our panelist Chris Buskirk is from. And in his ad, Blake said, "You ought to be able to raise a family on one single income." That's the kind of economy he wants to build. And in response, the Pima County Democratic Party tweeted, "We need to build an economy where you can afford to raise a family on one single income. That's code for women should not work." And then hashtag Handmaid's Tale. And we saw it during the most recent Democratic presidential primary. Kristen Gillibrand, if anybody remembers her, tried to hit Joe Biden with this theme that one-earner families somehow mean that women shouldn't be in the workplace. And as we saw, her candidacy failed, and Joe Biden is now president. So this is a live debate, and one that I think is especially interesting to the right. Do we want to commit to building an economy where you can afford to raise a middle-class family on one single income? And if so, how do we get there? I'm going to go from left to right, or from my right to my left, and we'll start with you, Sam.
Thank you, Helen. I think of this in terms of opportunity costs. I wear many hats. I don't just do family policy, don't just do poverty policy. But when we have debates about industrial policy, let's say, it comes down to comparative advantage, right? Is Japan's comparative advantage making rice, right? As I think was the example that we heard the other day. And there's similar dynamics in the family. As we've become richer, it's become the case that, just like a lawyer isn't their own secretary, why should the mother be their own person raising their own child? We're increasingly headed to a place where both public policy, but also by dint of our affluence, the opportunity cost and the comparative advantage of actually raising your own kids is declining. And we're seeing that accelerate with efforts to make that a permanent fixture of our public policy through national daycare, where we will have specialists in child rearing. And I think that we've been evolving on this earth for 1 million years, and there's nothing that really comes more natural to humans than raising their own kids. But yet there is this brute fact that if you're a college-educated woman, maybe even graduate education, by pure economics, why would you exit the labor force even temporarily to raise a family when that's not what the economics dictate? So I think when we're thinking about how to make America a more pro-family economy, we have to think it through that lens. There's two ways we can adjust opportunity costs. We can reduce the opportunity cost of raising a family, or we can raise the opportunity cost of the opposite. And when I think about what we can actually do in either of those directions, one of the things that's really depressing family formation right now is, I think, a culture of workism, or what Lyman Stone has talked about. When you look across Northern Europe, where fertility rates are very low, it's not an accident that they also have incredible subsidies for childcare. When you look in East Asia, where the fertility rate is even lower, Japan is famous for their insane work hours. And I don't expect the Republican Party to be the party of the four-day work week anytime soon. But there really needs to be we really need to begin addressing that sort of orientation towards workism. When it comes to the other side of opportunity cost, education in itself shifts opportunity cost. One of the best, one of the main drivers of U.S. declining fertility rates and family formation has been the rise in educational attainment by women, and it's a wonderful thing. But education itself has become incredibly lengthy and costly, and especially when you exit college with a huge amount of student debt, that is debt that you are only able to pay down by maintaining your attachment to work. JD mentioned the other night about Hungary's policies. One of their policies was to forgive student loan debt specifically for any woman who started a family. And I think that's, you can frame that in terms of, insane proto-nationalist policy or something like that, but really I think it's solving a market failure. We create indentured servants who have to pay down the cost of their education, and by doing so end up delaying the time when they can start a family, and by the time you're in your 30s, you're not going to have 6 kids. There's certain biological realities we have to face and structure the economy around those realities. When it comes to childcare, there are different ways of doing childcare. You can have the early childhood educator with the credential stamped on their forehead. In DC, now to work at a childcare center, you have to have a 2-year associate's degree. That's all pretty ridiculous in my view. We talk a lot about pseudoscience, and education research is probably the epicenter for some of the worst social science in academia. It's not even like that they don't replicate. It's like they don't even do the studies. They just sort of shoot from the hip. And where it's leading is to the left will dress this up in technocratic terms. We're just trying to increase GDP, get increased labor force participation. But it's very clear that there are at least 2 different goals at play. There's the goal of equalizing outcomes in the labor market. We have this persistent gender pay gap. And the reason for that is because women are at a biological disadvantage, and so we have to really rectify that with the state. But then also addressing the dynamics of gender and culture more broadly. The other day, Melissa Botek, who used to run Center for American Progress's poverty shop, tweeted something like, "We need race and equity-centered universal daycare." And I said, okay, this is a very pluralistic country we live in, and it's fine if you want to send your kid to that system, just like it's fine if a Catholic parent wants to send their kid to Catholic school. But just because one is secular doesn't make it any less sectarian, right? And we have to begin thinking about these things in those terms. Raising your kids is one of the most precious parts of life. Like what you teach your kid, what values you instill in them. And it's not an exaggeration to say that the left is trying to get you while you're young in this case. And when I called her out on that, she said, we're not social engineering. This is just raise GDP go up or whatever. And one of the people who jumped to her defense said this is ridiculous. And then I looked at her bio, and she was a sociologist. And in her bio line, it said, "The nuclear family is radioactive." And then I clicked on her research page, and it was all about how childcare policies can shape family norms and help contribute to defamiliarization, which is a buzzword for, uprooting the deep patriarchal structures of the family. And they're not going to lead on that, obviously, but that is a lot of what this is about. And I think it's going to be bad for families, but also bad for politics. If you thought the Common Core debate was bad, wait until it's Common Core for Baby Einstein, right? And they have these books like The Anti-Racist Baby. I don't think that kids are born into the world being racist. It's not. We can talk about adults, but like at that point, especially when you're also sort of instilling this ideology of blank slateism, where minds are infinitely malleable, and if we just have the right childcare early enough, we're going to somehow create geniuses of everybody. But it's not good, and I think the right has yet to really. I've been shouting this from the rooftops for a while, but the right has yet to develop a clear response to this, because when you just talk about socialism or big government, there's different kinds of big government, right? We're not as worried about Social Security because it's not telling senior citizens how to live their lives. What we're really mad about is social engineering, and also the way that the left are using these programs like daycare to build a constituency, right? The moment those childcare centers pop up, they'll be rank and file voting members of the Democratic Party. They'll have federations. They'll probably unionize, and soon enough you have an entrenched interest group. So when it comes to addressing this, I think we both need alternatives. We can't just stand athwart history. We need to say what is the right approach. And I've been a long-time advocate of just giving parents money through the child tax credit. But we can do more than that, because especially when it comes to fertility, just giving parents money is insufficient. It can move the needle, but we really need a broader cultural, what I've called a whole society approach. And so, some ideas I've had here, one of the biggest outliers on the fertility front has been Israel. Israel has very high rates of family formation. They also have very high rates of female education. So I really wanted to try to understand what is Israel doing different. And one of the things they do is they take this whole society approach, where at every strata of society, in the workplace, in universities, they are instilling a message that you can create and start a family and it will be easy. They have childcare services at college. They have a thing called the parenting hour, where new mothers, after they return from maternity leave, remain able to take an hour or two off to run home, run some errands, be with their child. And all those little things, they add up. They instill a message that we're constructing society around humans rather than having humans be restructured to match the economy. And I think there's opportunities also to sort of push the envelope into places where conservatives haven't really gone before. So at the state level, it's clear to me that one of the biggest drivers of family breakdown, especially in the African American community, has been the war on drugs and criminal justice. And when you lock up 22 million black men since 1980, that has to have an effect on family formation, family norms. And right now we have something like 3 million children in this country that have fathers who are in prison. And when we talk about a whole society approach, governors should be, and state legislatures should be pushing to improve family visitation policies. This will be something that sort of cuts against the normal axes of American politics, but you do the crime, you serve the time, but that doesn't mean that you can't be in your child's life. And I think bigger picture, again, these things add up. And then lastly, I think the right needs to get used to, using the administrative state to advance its own ends, because the left knows how to do that. One of the things that I've called for, and this is maybe as out there as giving parents votes for their kids, but I think those are good ideas too. I call it ballot harvesting. Every time we have a new regulation in this country, it goes through, if it's a large regulation, it goes through a cost-benefit analysis. And those cost-benefit analyses, they look at everything. A human life is worth $10 million. So if this drug saves 5 years of human life. What does that mean for the regulation? Our policy puts zero weight on the life that can be created. It's all about preventing fatality and not about creating life. And if there, when Obama in 2012 convened 12 federal agencies to put together a social cost of carbon, it was because he saw climate change as an urgent issue. And he understood that with the regulatory apparatus, if you had a cost for carbon, there's a cascading effect where every single one of these policies ends up baking that into their analysis. We need to begin thinking in those terms and saying, what is the cost of regulation that has these anti-fertility biases that we just don't talk about? A famous example that has been sort of popularized recently was this finding that car seat laws have led to something like 300,000 fewer kids being born since 1980. And the reason is because as car seat laws have ratcheted up, now you start with a baby, but now you're like 5 years old and still in a car seat. You might have 1 or 2 kids, but when you go to have your third, you say, well, it doesn't fit in the minivan anymore, right? And you don't really think about those things, but these things are everywhere, right? And I think if those little tweaks were made, it wouldn't just have the cascading effect on policy, but it would also drive research into methods of actually quantifying the impact of these things, right? So like the US government relies on, right now, the Guttmacher Institute for the majority of its data on reproductive health, right? And Guttmacher, if you don't know, is basically the Planned Parenthood's think tank. And they, I'm not going to impugn their work. They do good, accurate work. But when we outsource this data collection to these agencies with different motives, family planning policy ends up taking a certain character, right? And so this isn't just about like defunding Guttmacher when they do receive millions of dollars in federal grants. So I'm not saying don't do that either, but it's about building alternatives. And with alternatives, with research in the pipeline, and having the conversation shift to new institutions, I think more ideas like this will be generated. And I think it's a really important prerequisite step if we're going to actually move the needle, because it's just a glacial issue. You can't turn culture on the dime.
Very good. Thank you, Sam. Ramesh.
Well, I agree with nearly everything that Sam said, with the great exception being his little dig at standing athwart history, which actually is what we should be doing with respect to fertility trends and the allegedly inevitable decline in them. And to go back to the initial question, I think that Blake Masters is right about this. It should be a goal of ours that people should be able to raise a family on one income. That, of course, does not imply that people should be discouraged from having two-income households. But I do think that the issue of opportunity cost that Sam raises is really worth going into on this point, because it seems to me that the problem that we've had on this issue is not so much that having children has become less affordable in absolute terms. It's that having a large family is putting you behind your peers more and more. That is to say, the marginal cost of having a child versus not having a child, having an additional child versus not having an additional child, that has been increasing. Now, I have been working on this issue since I think some of the people in this room were just tax credit gleams in their parents' eyes. I'm happy to say there don't seem to be many boomers here, so Helen is safe. And one of the points I've been making a lot in all of this time is that existing federal policy includes a large, though implicit, bias against having large families. And that's because of the structure of our entitlement programs. And it's something that some of the early theorists of the welfare state, like Gunnar Myrdal, understood, that if you socialize the benefits of having and raising children, the benefits that come with these costs and these opportunity costs, then you are diminishing the incentive to have children. And there is some social science evidence suggesting that the introduction of the old age entitlements and their expansion has in fact reduced birth rate. Now, I've made this argument, well, first because I think it's true, but second because I thought it was important to help build support among conservatives and libertarians for doing something like an enlarged child credit by saying, look, even if one accepts the idea that government policy should be strictly neutral on all of these issues, we're not there, and a credit is a useful way of counteracting the bias that we have in current policy. And I would say that this argument has met with mixed success on the right, but I do think it has been important. One of the things you get a lot in this debate, or at least I have over the years, is a kind of, let's say, a doctrinaire libertarian kind of pushback. And the most telling form it has ever taken, in my experience, was when a supply-sider said to me, I like skiing. Why can't we get a tax credit for skis? If you accept a certain kind of view of children as just a hobby, right, then that is going to make some sense. And one of the reasons I've made this entitlement argument is to sort of suggest that even on rightly understood market principles and libertarian principles, that's not right. That's not the right way to think about it. And I think now I don't think that sort of counteracting the bias of our existing policies is the limit of what we should be willing to do, but it certainly should be at least the minimum. It should be the baseline of what we're prepared to do. And I guess one last point that I'll make on this is another thing that a point of confusion that you get, not just on the right, but on the left and in the center, is this idea, so you're trying to bribe people into having more children. And that, I think, is also the wrong way to think about this. First of all, the kinds of amounts of money we're talking about wouldn't do it in terms of actually changing people's desires in this way. But also, we have decades worth of data that consistently suggest that people want to have more kids than they end up having. And so we are helping people to achieve one of their great goals, and one of the things that really is conducive to long-term satisfaction in life. And I can't really think of anything that the government does that is better or nobler than that.
All right, Chris.
So when I looked at the topic of this panel, I started to sort of think about what I was supposed to say, and I thought about this documentary that Francis Schaeffer did in the 70s called How Then Shall We Live? And Schaeffer was a Presbyterian pastor and theologian. It's interesting. It's on Amazon Prime if anybody wants to watch it. It's very good. But it seemed like that was, in a sense, that's the underlying question of this whole conference. Well, we're talking about our political economy, and so that's, in a sense, that's instrumental in answering the bigger question for this country. How are we going to live, and how are we going to continue to live together as a country? And so when we look at the panel topic, thriving families and middle-class prosperity, and in case anybody's wondering, I'm in favor of both. We had them both, though, in this country at one time, and it's not that we don't have it now, it's that we have a lot less of it, and the trajectory is going in the wrong direction. And so, in thinking about that question, I come back to like, what happened? Like, where did it go? Like, how did we get it in the first place? Where did it go, and how do we get it back? I was looking at, as one does, I was looking at fertility data this morning, because the half-yearly data has come out for basically almost the whole world now, based on the live births for the first 6 months of the year. In the United States, dropped off another 0.2. So we were in 2019, we were at about 1.75, fertility rate of 1.75. So bearing in mind that the replacement rate is 2.1, last year was like 1.64 or 1.65, and through half of this year we're at like 1.55. So in the course of 2 years, we've dropped by 2/10. Yeah, I mean, COVID is certainly a part of that, but it doesn't, but the trend has been there for a long time, and it's consistent across both the developed and the developing world. Across the world, with weirdly two exceptions, fertility rates keep declining, and so the question of how do we have prosperity and thriving families, I think, is a live one, not just for us, so that's where we're most focused, but for the whole world. And one of the things I noted is that, I guess to use Blake's framing, which is one of the things that we should sort of aspirationally look for as a sign of national vitality is if we are able to, the median person, the average American, is able to support a family of 4 on a single median wage, right? That's really the question. Can you just do the basics of human life, having a family and providing for the next generation without doing something extraordinary? It's obviously possible to support a family of 4 in this country, but it just gets harder and harder. And so that's where I come back to the idea of prosperity, which is, what is it? And this is why some of the overall discussion around this topic, I think, and I don't mean on this panel, I just mean in general, is maybe needs to zoom out a little bit. Like, how do we define what prosperity is? And when we think about prosperity purely in material terms, then we have defined it incorrectly. So there's definitely a spiritual element to it, which, this is the political economy conference, but I would just want to, we won't go into that in too much length, but I do want to say I do think that's a big part of it, a subject for another day, I think. But the material part of it, we need to be thinking about in terms other than purely economic terms, meaning GDP. GDP is a good measure for certain things, primarily consumption. But the idea that we can use GDP as shorthand for national or civilizational health or vitality is just wrong. Our GDP has continued to go up for the past 50 years, while basically every other marker of national health has either flatlined or declined. Median real income has sort of crept up a little bit over the past 5 decades. Family formation has declined. Fertility rates have declined. The rates of significant lifelong disease have increased over that time. And so why don't we start to think about prosperity in more concrete terms? Like, this is my problem with GDP, not that it's incorrect, it's that it's overused. Is that if we just use the common sense understanding of what middle-class prosperity would be and what thriving families would look like, we would go back and say, well, we're doing well as a country if people are healthier, living longer, if they are getting married and having kids, and having enough kids to provide for the next generation. And in fact, all of those things are heading in the wrong direction. And so what do we do about it, right? It is easy and fun to diagnose the problems. It is harder and, I don't know, maybe it could be fun too to figure out the solutions. But that's where I really come out on this, is to say, let's think about it in these very concrete terms. If we want to figure out if we're doing the right things as a country, we can't just turn on CNBC and say, great, Q3 GDP up 2.5%, we're good. Meanwhile, people aren't getting married, people aren't having kids, et cetera, et cetera. The question I ask people sometimes when I talk about like the health issue is they say, isn't it fantastic that we have these great drugs to control diabetes? Yeah, but why do we have more diabetics? Like, we have great drugs to control heart disease. Yeah, but we have more heart disease. Like, maybe there's a predicate to all of this that we need to be thinking about in other terms. And so I guess and this comes back to the Israel point, which is one of the 2 countries that has a positive fertility rate. The other one, weirdly, is Uzbekistan. So if there's an Uzbekistan expert in the room, you can...
I've been there.
Okay, so...
I've been doing some work on religious freedom, but I have not been taking a look at that. So I'm now...
See, Johnny, you bring everybody to the table here. But Israel is such an interesting place because, in the United States, religious people still have positive fertility rates by and large. And that is generally true around the world, certainly higher than secular people. One of the answers to why does Israel still have a positive fertility rate is the heredity. That's partially true, but the secular Israelis also have a much higher fertility rate. And so the question there is why, and what can we learn from it? At least that's one of my questions. And one of the, I guess one of my partial answers, and this leads to one of the things I think we need to think about as Americans and what we can do here, is that there really is a sense of national purpose in Israel that we have lost, and that we should try and regain. Israel, as we know, lives in a very difficult neighborhood. It maintains that sort of frontier spirit. Like Israelis have to cohere if they want to continue to exist. And there are, shall we say, positive externalities to the pressure that Israel is under. And this is, you can look back at any number of states that have sort of faced these existential threats. It tends to have positive impacts on national unity. I mean, it's a good thing that we do not face an existential threat, but the question is, how do we regain some of that sort of frontier spirit that brings about national solidarity? And with that national solidarity comes a sense of purpose, which makes people more prolific. And that creates a culture in which families are valued in a way. We're talking about, like, there's a family hour at the universities and that sort of thing. It just makes things easier because everybody's having kids, and people know that the country is trying to do X. There's a telos to the country, and you want to have the next generation because you believe in the future. And that is so much more motivating and profound than believing in the next quarter's GDP number. And I guess here's my one suggestion, which it will be sort of my pie in the sky suggestion. I just want to say that when it comes to natalist policies, child allowances, maybe forgiving a student debt, or there's another Hungarian policy I think is interesting, which is women who have, it used to be 4, now I think it's if they have 3 children or more, they don't pay income tax for the rest of their lives. Fine, sign me up, all for it. Let's think even bigger. And trying to, what I would say is circumvent the pathological risk aversion that we have in this country right now, and regaining that sort of American frontier spirit, maybe create a legal framework in which people can start something new. And I would just sort of jump off with some of the work that the Charter Cities Institute has done there, literally allow people to create a new community that allows them to create a new legal rubric within the confines of federal law and the Constitution, but gives them a chance to build something. People, I think, are too confined in their thinking, and part of that has a material reason because we already live in space that is controlled. We have a lot of space in this country. Matt Iglesias wants to import something like 47 billion people from outer space. Maybe we can just take Iowa and figure out a way to build a thriving city-state there. That's my big picture suggestion. So I'll leave it at that.
That's hard to follow. No, so interesting to speak into it now after having heard all of you speak. The economy has changed, and we do have to acknowledge that. So my father raised a family on a mill salary. When I graduated from high school, my friends worked in retail, and they had their own cars and their own apartments. It's different now in today's economy, as I think all of you know. Family wage jobs are harder to find, especially, in some of the more historical Midwest places like that. And so, we've all heard the Federal Reserve statistic that 44% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. 17% of all Americans can't pay their bills each month. So an unplanned pregnancy, or any pregnancy, is a financial catastrophe. So you're sitting in this situation where, over half of the women who seek an abortion cite the cost of the child as one of the contributing factors. So we're sitting here in this situation where, we have the big picture, which is how do we change the economy so that there's just less pressure for both parents to work all the time, this working mentality that that's all life is. But yet we also have to deal with what's happening today, and that's that families, on both sides of the aisle, you see this destruction of family, but especially in the lower income communities, as we've seen, scholars on the right and the left document for us. And, so when you take a look at that, I was so interested to try to figure out, well, what can we do that actually would help strengthen the families that are struggling now, especially in the lower income side. And so, after, I don't know if you guys all know this, but do you know the one issue that President Trump had like a full white paper on when he ran for president? There was only one issue. Does anyone know which one it was? But you guys, it was paid family leave. And to be honest, believe it or not, that was the one full thought through policy at the time. So I was able, in 2000, which is in 2017, is to start this process of just saying, is there a way to approach this from a conservative standpoint? Is there a way that we can look at family, we can look at government differently, and how government can support families, not to grow government, but to use what's already there? So we started working to bring in conservative leaders, into the White House to have this discussion about tax policy, and would always segue right away into paid family leave. So I was able to be in the room where people literally said the word for the first time. And because it was just such a new idea for conservatives to think about some program like this. And so it was really interesting. So I was a part of an effort to raise some funds and have some events that sometimes are 50-50 positive, negative, to just have conversations. What do we do as conservatives on issues? How do we help families? I mean, what if every family had the opportunity to start off strong, where they had time together those first few weeks, those first few months? I mean, would that give us a shot at having stronger communities? Right now, 25% of mothers go back to work within 10 to 14 days of having a child. You can't even process what that means. And of course, fathers go back even sooner. And so many of these women that go back that sooner in retail and service jobs. And so we're in this situation where families aren't spending that time together in the very beginning. Only 19% of people have access to paid leave. We're not talking about taking vacation days and things like that, because it gets a little complicated. And really, is that fair? When you to consider that paid leave really is a tough one for me. If a mother can't take a day off to be at a child's school because she took all her time off for her pregnancy. So in terms of how we can structure that. It was really interesting to me because, even though I'm a big fan of looking at the big picture and how can we change the economy to be friendlier to families, but how can we also help families today? And as Chris was talking about, the birth rate should be 2.1 per child, per mother, live births per mother per year, and instead, or not per year total, sorry. Instead, wow.
That's too ambitious.
Well, that's not even Israel. It's 1.55. We're just, and the other thing is, paid leave has been shown to keep mothers off public assistance. I think people that have paid leave are, 39% less likely to go on public assistance, 40% less likely to use food stamps. So we do have, I brought this, you can download some information we put together that is just really statistics and ways to talk about this. That's on paidleaveforfamilies.com. And so you can take a look and just kind of find out for yourself. But it's been really interesting to see how especially senators, have really been creative in how to approach something like paid leave. So let me just throw out to you just the way that a few of them have approached it. You may have heard from, I don't know if Senator Rubio talked about this at all when he was here, but he was the first one out with a plan that basically would be you withdraw take 1, 2, or 3 months of paid leave from Social Security, and then you just retire later and pay it back. And then, so we have Senator Lee and Senator Ernst about to come out with a plan that's very similar with just some changes to that this Congress. And then the newest one really is a bipartisan plan with Senator Cassidy and Sinema that you withdraw $5,000 after the birth or adoption of a child, and then instead of writing off $2,000 off your child tax credit each year for that child, you'd write off $1,500 and basically pay it back over the course of 10 years. So these are just, interesting ways of how we can support families right now. And I like them because these are creative ways by using government instead of growing government. And I think that's a really important distinction. I think the key for this one is going to be a bipartisan solution since we don't control anything right now. So it has to be one of those conversations. I hope that family policy will stay in a space that stays out of the political crossfire. I mean, there's enough pork, there's enough ugly conversations we can have at each other. I'm hoping that things about having to do with the family can be a little sacred and maybe stay off the firing range. But I'm excited at the way of looking at government differently to support families. And obviously Hungary has been, just a leader on that. We had an event where we were talking about paid leave, and the ambassador from Hungary, he got up and he's like, you guys, like, paid leave is like this much of it, and it really is just a piece. And I'm not trying to infer in any way, shape, or form that paid leave is the answer for all family problems, because I'm just saying that as conservatives, we can't always just let the other side craft these ideas. We should be driving some of these and make sure that they fit our principles and they support families the way we want them to. But I think it's not just paid leave. I think a lot of issues we can look at government differently and try to figure out. And I think Sam's done some really great work on this in trying to see how we can better support families and not just look at everything just the way it's been done. Because the way it's been done, it hasn't been working because here we are, right? The destruction of family, it's impossible financially. We're all up here because you guys are going to pay the price for that. So how can we, first of all, help you where you are if you want to start a family, but also how can we change things going forward to be a better environment for families?
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine, for bringing us full circle. Shortly, we will be transitioning into the Q&A, so I urge you all to log on to the ISI app and send in your questions, comments, facts about Uzbekistan.
A lovely place, so.
Maybe we can bring the Uzbeks to Iowa, and that'll
There you
be
go.
the Buzzkirk Iglesias plan. Well, while you all are preparing your questions, I'll start off with one of my own. The decline in fertility that the United States has seen has been largely a result of people having zero children. That is, the millennials are on track to be the least married generation in American history. Fully 25% of millennials are on track to end their childbearing years with 0 kids. There are a lot of great policy ideas out there for getting married couples who right now have 1 kid to be able to have 2 or 3 or 4. Are there any aimed at getting people to pair off in the first place? Since that seems to be where most of the numerical decline is coming from.
Well, going back to my education point, I think delaying family formation can often become, you put it off 1 year, you put it off another year, and as a millennial myself, like that's what I see around me. I see folks who say, well, I want to start a family, but I need to get my bachelor's first, and then once they get their bachelor's, they say, well, I want to start a family, but I got to get my master's first, or I want to move up the career ladder. And so I think there needs to be more thought put into how do we shorten these education durations. Like, you do not. I do not need the 12 years of education that I have. I could did it in far quicker, because that delay ends up becoming kind of permanent, and people have well-known behavioral biases where they do not understand, that the clock is ticking, so to speak, and then also at the college level, there is a huge mismatch in terms of like sex ratios. We know that women are graduating at much higher rates, attending college at much higher rates, and so that ends up sorting people apart from each other, so they can't even pair off. My undergrad was 70% female, something like that. So there's a certain game of musical chairs that has to be fixed.
Musical. All right, never mind. I think there is one of the cultural factors that we need to tackle here, in addition to the economic ones, is that there is an exaggerated fear of the instability of early marriage, which gets transmitted to kids from their parents, to young adults from their parents, like, you're too young to get married. And that has the actual basis of this is studies which do show that if you're 18 or 19 and you get married, that your odds are worse, but they're not really significantly worse if you're 22 or 23 and people have overlearned that lesson. In terms of policy stuff, well, Senator Hawley has a very big marriage bonus plan that he has advanced as part of his own child allowance scheme. But I think that we basically need to see these as interrelated things, and that particularly for the people who are most likely to have a couple kids and to be discouraged by economic circumstances from it, it's just sort of the whole package of making it possible to have a more thriving married family life. If they can see that as a goal that they can attain, then they're more likely to take those steps.
Any ideas over here?
Well, yeah, just I guess a couple things. One is there's multiple problems going on when it comes to marriage. You know, if you think about if you think about it in economic terms, with the middle class and above still has a bias towards marriage. The middle, you know, sort of the lower end of the middle class and below, there is no marriage culture left. And so I think you need to think about any prospective policy plans, understanding that it's not a single issue. I would be very inclined to describe it as a spiritual issue and have that discussion. But from a public policy standpoint, the idea that if you're pretty far down the income ladder, like the neighborhood you live in, there's just not a lot of married people there. And so how do you address that question? Whereas, again, the further you go up the spectrum, I think you run into some of the questions that we were talking about, like, oh, you've delayed marriage because you wanted to get a master's. Like, that's not the case for the people who are working at Walmart. So we just need to think about it in those terms.
Right, and I'm just, this week was presented with what we've all heard many times, which is a couple with young children that if they get married, lose all their benefits. And so you have that in the lower income communities. They want to get married, but it's just impossible from a financial standpoint what would happen in the kind of loss of benefits. And so we again have that marriage penalty that seems to be impossible to fix in the lower income communities. But it's so sad to think that this family with 2 children that I'm close to wants to get married and what it would mean for them. And it's real life. It's the day-to-day life that they just can't take that risk of trying to make ends meet.
If I just a second bite of the apple here, one thing that I've been going to church for about 2 decades now on a consistent basis, and I don't think I've ever heard a sermon or homily where the priest said, maybe you should think about marrying your boyfriend or girlfriend, the other parent of your child, you know, and that would be nice to have as well.
I see we've got some questioners gathering at our microphones. Before I take yours, I'll pick one from the app, from Jonah Wendt, who asks, how does the presence or absence of community play into family formation? Is the broader decline of civil society a factor here that we need to look at? I see everyone nodding, so is that just we can take that as a yes and move on.
I was going to say, for sure. I mean, especially in lower income communities, the lack of civil society and in community is a real problem, and it hurts everybody. It hurts everyone of all ages. I mean, we're all reading about the loneliness, issues for people all through, this last year, especially with people being more isolated, but just loneliness in general because that lack of community, lack of civil society, and that's impacting the family. And these are all things that we need to be rethinking what we prioritize, what we fund.
I'd put more emphasis on the reverse. You have a weaker civil society when you don't have as many stable families. And for that matter, to go back to the point of the one-income household that we have in various ways discouraged, you're going to have a weaker civil society when a higher proportion of your parents are going out and working. I mean, that's just an inevitability. It's not, maybe not always a bad thing, but if we make it possible for more households to succeed as one-income, 2-parent households, I think you will get a stronger civil society.
Another dimension of community that I think is important comes down to peer effects, which are by far one of the biggest sort of variables to explain your decision to raise a family. If people around you are raising family, you feel pressure. And it's interesting because I go to events like this hosted by conservative organizations. I also go to similar policy things hosted by center-left places. You never hear a baby cooing at the center-left events, and I think it's wonderful when you are at events and at a movie theater and you hear a baby crying or on an airplane, and people, get very, mad, right? And especially in DC and big cities where most people live these days, they've become, playgrounds for the young and the restless, where, going, if you're trying to raise a family and you go to a dinner party and they don't have a kids table, like it's sort of a microaggression, right? So, getting those community effects up and peer effects, I think, is really important, and that means like making cities more livable for families. I went to a social science event that was Facebook hosted, and I talked to one of their demographers, and my idea to him was, well, I know you ran this study that showed that depending on how you tweak the news feed, you can have like happiness contagions. Why don't we try that for baby photos and see if there's a family formation contagion or something like that. He was not thrilled about the idea, but yeah.
Well, in the interests of normalizing children in public spaces, I will say that if you heard a baby coo during this panel, that was mine. That's my baby's laugh. And thank you to ISI for making it possible for me to bring him along. All right, let's take one from this microphone. Sir.
My name is Bob Patterson. I served at the Social Security Administration in the Trump administration. And my question deals in answering this question about how do we revive middle-class prosperity and great thriving among our families. Can we learn it all from the mid-century miracle? You go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And of course, if you remember, the 50s and 60s and 70s was a middle-class economy. We had very few extremes of poverty and wealth. We had the exaltation of the family wage, which the New Dealers called the American standard. And if you compare the 50s, 60s, and 70s with the 80s and 90s and parts of the aughts, the 50s and 60s and 70s, shaped by the New Deal and the social conservatives that drove the New Deal, is there anything we can learn as conservatives from our Democratic brethren, 60 years ago, who shaped much of the mid-century miracle, relative to the Reagan and Clinton boom, where you do not have the all the indicators leaves the Reagan boom in disarray relative to what we saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So is there a way we can learn from the New Dealers who were explicitly socially conservative? You look at
No, that's a very provocative question. Let's see if there's anyone here
not
willing to stand
not
up
only were they
for
explicitly socially
FDR or LBJ.
Not only were they socially conservative, but they upheld the great American system of economics. And it seems like the departure from the American system of economics and the New Deal social policies have wreaked havoc on this country now. One other thing too is that
No, sir, you have been talking for 1 minute. You are not allowed to have one other thing.
There's
It was a very good question.
Can we learn from the New Dealers?
Guards, seize him. No, really, very good question. Thank you. Anyone willing to take the bait?
Yeah, I'll take the bait as a first step. So I'll say this: the New Dealers who weren't communists were social conservatives, and there was. I mean, this is an actual bifurcation. FDR's administration. Go back and read FDR's first inaugural. If you gave that speech today, you would be seized as a fascist or possibly a Christian nationalist, depending on which audience you were in front of. Here's the challenge, I think, that we have with trying to recapture the economic reality of the immediate post-war period. One is part of that was a unique situation. We had just won a world war and were the only major economic power still standing that had not had their industrial base destroyed. So that meant that a pretty unique set of circumstances obtained to the United States at that point. The other part is that we were right then, we being America, but we also being the West defined more broadly, we're basically at the tail end of a 3-century boom in technological innovation that stopped sometime in the 60s. And so the thing that made wages and living standards rise, like real wages and real living standards rise for all that time, was the fact that we had a total factor productivity boom that lasted for 300 years. And that, by which I mean we would be able to develop ways to do more with less. And that just stopped, or it at least maybe now applies just in certain spaces, digital technology and telecom being the major examples. But without that type of innovation leading to productivity growth, that's the source of real economic growth, that and population growth. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to see how you can recapture strong real wage growth. So I think that's, I like the idea of a family wage, but there are some structural challenges that we need to overcome.
The conservative family scholar Alan Carlson has argued that there were features of the federal tax code in particular at that time that encouraged family formation and expansion, in particular income splitting, generous personal exemptions, and then he also adds in high marginal tax rates as part of that. But I guess it's sort of a mixed picture because that's how we got the boomers.
That's very true.
Are you going to take that bait?
No, I'm going to let that hang there. We have an excellent question from Robert Bellafiore. What ideological blind spots stop conservatives from presenting a pro-family agenda? It seems like a lot of the people here are on board with the conservatives being the pro-family party, but that doesn't seem to have materialized yet among the politicians. What's standing in the way?
Well, I think that we've talked about some of that also, and Chris's remarks are making me think about how many times I've talked to Republican politicians or experts and conservatives who think of all of these family issues as a kind of a distraction from the economic issues that really matter. And I always think that it's instructive that the etymological root of economy is household management, right? Yeah. It's not a distraction, it's a return to the roots of what all of these things are there for.
Yeah, a few years ago I wrote a piece about Hungary's policies, and ever since I've been invited to every damn embassy event. And I went to one a few years ago with the Hungary's family policy minister and a bunch of American conservatives, including Gorka gave a big speech about how family is the foundation of Christendom and all this stuff. And then the family minister came up and gave a lengthy presentation about everything they're doing, followed by a panel that had some leading evangelical conservatives. I won't name names, but the first person who spoke, very prominent leader of the Christian right, and said, his jaw was on the floor, basically. He had to pick it up. But then the first words out of his mouth were, well, here in America, we take a small government approach. And it struck me as just how subordinated that part of the coalition had been to the Wall Street Journal editorial board stance on these issues. So I think there's a moment now where that part of the coalition is reasserting itself and saying we want more than just judicial nominations. We want actually a say in public policy.
All right, we can take a question from this microphone.
Great, thank you. I'll start my stopwatch for my question. But so I work in finance, and in finance, everything's about risk. So investment manager earns even more money, but takes more risk. That could be a bad investment manager, right? And so how much of this is that our economy, one facet of our economy is that we have more risk. So for employees, even if they earn more than they did before, the obvious example representation of that is companies are moving from defined benefit to defined contribution plans. That's one facet of it, but job security, all these things. That doesn't seem to help family formation if you're thinking about risk going ahead, right? So I guess the first side of the question is, how do you think this is a factor that people need to consider? It's not just giving people X amount of absolute dollars, but de-risking their lives or accounting for this risk. And the second side of that question is, and relate to the previous question, which is, how much do you think a traditional conservative economic orthodoxy, yesterday it was called market fundamentalism, free market, people want to get rid of Fannie Freddie, which in a way are de-risking people's mortgage, right, 30-year mortgage. How much do you think those are in conflict with some pro-family policies?
Another excellent question. If we have lots of job creation, but it's all in the gig economy, is that sufficiently stable, or is that too risky for people to build family?
Well, on the risk front, it's interesting. The biggest step function drop-off in American fertility occurred into the 2008 great financial crisis. and it hasn't recovered since. And trying to understand why that happened, but that didn't happen in Europe. They had lots of disruption, but they didn't have that effect trickle into family. And when we looked into this, the one explanation that made sense to me was, we rely on employer-sponsored health insurance to such a great extent that, when mothers or prospective mothers, lose their job, whether due to a recession or something else, they have a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk attached to, decisions around pregnancy, because, pregnancy is risky, right? It's hard to deny that. Even people with insurance, I think the average maternity cost is $4,500 out of pocket, right? Like that's on top of like all the other bills that come along with starting a family. And so, again, trying to think outside the box. There's a lot of debate about where we do healthcare expansions, and I think universal healthcare for anyone who wants to start a family and has the complications arising of pregnancy and things like that would be, I think, the low-hanging fruit before we talk about other expansions. And part of it would be going to your point about de-risking the choice to have kids.
So if I could jump in on the market fundamentalism point, look, I mean, I've been talking a fair amount about a certain kind of doctrinaire, conservative and libertarian approach to economics. But there are also these places where you've got big cost centers for middle-class families that are relevant to these family decisions. And I'm thinking of the 3 H's in particular: healthcare, higher education, housing. All of those are places where you've got very high costs to a significant degree driven by government policies, federal, state, and local. And so those are areas where I would like to see a little bit more market fundamentalism than we've got.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Let's take it from this microphone.
Thank you very much. My question is concerning all the policies that you've suggested, more or less, the justifications for doing them are very reminiscent of the justifications for Social Security, for education, and for all the social welfare programs for African Americans in LBJ's Great Society. What guarantee for all the proposed programs that you're offering won't lead them to be corrupted? Because the justifications are the exact same for public ed and welfare and all these things, which, as Thomas Sowell said, great intentions don't necessarily translate to great outcomes. We all want better families, but will government involvement really bring that about, being that government has such a terrible track record of doing it? So I'm not doubting anyone's intentions on the panel, anyone here, but I am extremely skeptical about government actually doing what it sets out to do, or what the people intend for it to do. Education's the best example. Nothing has caused more decline in our culture than education, than the education system. So what do you say about all these great programs getting corrupted in, over the next generation or so?
I'd ask the question, what would be the corruption of a child allowance?
That's what I'm saying is, like, how could any of us know? Because the same thing could be said about a welfare program in the 1960s. What could be wrong with helping a single mother by, giving her money to get by? It's the exact same thing. I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know how it could fail, but I can see that it's failed.
I think different policies and different policy approaches have different relative risks for failure like that. A national daycare push, even if you supported the idea, has many more points of failure that involve it. And unlike giving parents cash, to the extent that they could misuse that cash, it's relatively isolated, right? But if we take over the entire childcare system by saying $10 a day childcare if you just go, come in the door, that isn't the risks of that are not isolated to any one individual. It ends up becoming an institutional failure. So I would just take a little more granular look at the types of policies that matter. When I mentioned, healthcare for maternity care and stuff like that, Medicaid already exists, and it began as a program for low-income pregnant women, and so like that segment of the population already has a lot of coverage. We're talking about making going back to the New Deal conservative vision of sort of broad-based entitlements for a real middle class, right? Not the LBJ vision of highly means-tested programs that try to socially engineer outcomes.
And how do you know the left or the government won't corrupt it down the line?
Well, when we
what
have
guarantee can
when
you
we have a daycare program, there's going to be debates over the curricula, right? And they're going to be very ugly. When you're giving parents cash, imagine going to Social Security and saying, we're going to get rid of your fixed income and replace it with a voucher for a nursing home, an EBT card, and we're only going to make you, buy the goat cheese or whatever. Like that would, when you give parents flexible resources, they're much more difficult to corrupt, in particular because they flow into local communities, versus when you take a more bureaucratic approach. And so I would point to that being a core distinction, bureaucracy versus resources.
And I think too, we talk about risk. I mean, what's the risk of doing nothing? Here we are talking about all the failure in our society for families. So I think we've all come to the point where the worst thing we can do is nothing. So not that there's probably worse, but we can do nothing. So the point is we're going to have to take some risks. But doing nothing is also a risk, and it means that the birth rate is probably going to keep falling, and it means we're going to have less families. And so, to me, there is some risk, but I think reevaluating them and trying to be smart about how we're approaching these things, giving people options, things like that are super important.
Let me just add that when conservatives are approaching these issues, they should draw a line that we want to pay for these programs in part by consolidating and abolishing the programs we dislike, right? And I think that's a big missing piece in the current debate. I've long been saying give parents cash, not childcare, and right now the Democrats are trying to do both, right? And so far, Senator Romney has stood up and said, let's if you're going to do a child benefit or a child allowance, let's at least pay for it, number one, and do it by collapsing and consolidating these child care subsidies, which end up being much more easily captured because they are, bureaucratic places full of social workers who all went to the same school and had the same worldview.
That's a great note on which to end. I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists.